The laughter started with the grass. Not the cabin. Not the chimney. Not even the strange piles of dirt rising around the property. The grass. Because Elias Turner spent most of spring cutting enormous sections of prairie sod and stacking them into neat rectangular bricks beside his house. Day after day he cut more. Long strips of thick earth tangled with roots and dry grass. Then he stacked them, hundreds of them, then thousands. People driving through Red Hollow slowed their wagons and stared. By summer they started asking questions. By autumn they started laughing. You planning on farming your walls? Building yourself a dirt castle? Man's gone crazy and started collecting grass. No one laughed harder than Harlan Pike. He stood outside the trading post one afternoon, watching Elias unload another wagon filled with sod bricks. You know what this fool's doing? He pointed dramatically toward Elias's cabin. He thinks dirt keeps winter out. Laughter exploded across the porch. Children picked up the joke immediately. Turner's dirt house. They repeated it whenever Elias rode through town. Adults repeated it because they thought it was clever. Elias ignored all of them, because unlike most people in Red Hollow, Elias remembered the winter that killed his father. 10 years earlier, a prairie storm arrived unexpectedly while they worked cattle north of the valley. The storm buried everything. Wind, snow, cold. Days later, rescue teams found Elias alive beneath an overturned wagon packed tightly with drifted snow and prairie grass. His father wasn't as fortunate, but Elias remembered something strange. Inside the packed snow and grass shelter, temperatures felt different. Not warm, stable. Outside the storm screamed. Inside the small space the air barely moved. That memory stayed with him for years, especially after he inherited his father's cabin. Because every winter the same battle repeated itself. Wind slipped through log cracks. Cold crept beneath floorboards. Snow piled against walls unevenly. Fires burned constantly while warmth escaped almost as quickly as it arrived. Every year felt exhausting. Then one summer, while helping railroad crews farther west, Elias saw something unexpected. Old prairie homesteads. Not ordinary cabins. Sod homes. Entire houses built directly from earth cut from the prairie itself. Most looked abandoned. But one old rancher explained something Elias never forgot. Prairie grass spent thousands of years surviving winter before we arrived. At first Elias laughed. Then the old man showed him. Sod wasn't simply dirt. It was densely woven earth, roots, trapped air, and insulation all bound together naturally. Thick sod changed temperature slowly. Wind struggled to pass through it. Cold moved through it reluctantly. That mattered. Very much. So when Elias returned home, he started cutting sod. Not for walls. For armor. Construction began during spring. He didn't rebuild the cabin. He surrounded it. Layer by layer thick sod bricks rose around the exterior walls, leaving small air gaps between the original cabin and the new outer barrier. Neighbors stared openly, because the cabin slowly disappeared beneath earth and grass. By midsummer, only windows, doors, and the roof remained clearly visible. Caleb Turner visited first. He climbed down from his horse and stood silently staring. Because the structure looked absurd. Absolutely absurd. The cabin appeared buried halfway underground despite standing completely above it. You serious? Elias kept stacking another row. Very. Caleb looked around slowly. You wrapped your cabin in dirt. Elias smiled faintly. Prairie. Caleb sighed. No, that's dirt. Elias laughed. Then he explained. Sod wasn't just soil. The woven roots trapped air naturally. Air resisted heat movement. The thick layers slowed temperature changes dramatically. More importantly, the sod walls blocked wind before it ever reached the actual cabin. Cold couldn't steal heat if it never touched the real walls directly. Caleb still looked doubtful. So grass keeps winter out. Elias smiled. When you say it like that, I sound ridiculous. That didn't help. The jokes continued all summer. Children asked whether flowers would grow from his walls. Harlan asked whether rabbits planned on moving in too. Even Caleb remained uncertain. Because from outside the place looked strange. Very strange. By autumn the transformation looked almost unbelievable. The cabin sat surrounded by thick prairie walls covered with living grass and packed roots. From a distance it looked less like a house and more like a piece of earth rising naturally from the plains. But Elias wasn't building for autumn. He was building for January. The first freeze arrived early. Thin ice-covered water troughs before sunrise while frost spread across windows throughout Red Hollow. Elias watched carefully, especially around the cabin walls. The difference appeared almost immediately. Wind reached the outer side walls, then disappeared. Snow piled evenly along lower sections, creating additional insulation instead of exposed pressure points. The original cabin walls beneath barely felt direct cold anymore. Days passed. Temperatures dropped further. Still, the effect continued. The cabin cooled more slowly overnight. Morning temperatures stayed steadier. Most surprising of all, what consumption dropped. Not dramatically, steadily, because heat wasn't escaping nearly as quickly anymore. Caleb noticed during another visit. He stepped inside after sunset and frowned. The fire burned low, very low, yet the cabin felt comfortable. How much wood are you burning? Elias looked up from repairing a harness. Less. Caleb stared. That shouldn't happen. Elias tapped the thick wall beside him. The prairie's helping. Caleb pressed his hand against the interior locks. Not freezing. Not even particularly cold. His eyes narrowed slightly. Huh. Elias smiled. That single word felt satisfying. Outside Red Hollow prepared for winter normally. More blankets. More wood. More repairs. Inside Elias's cabin preparation looked different. Smaller fires. Steady heat. Less worry. Then December arrived. And strange weather arrived with it. Pressure dropped quickly. Birds vanished. Old ranchers stopped smiling. Stories spread about a massive winter system rolling south across the plains. A bad one. Maybe the worst in decades. Elias looked toward the horizon one evening. Dark clouds stretched across the prairie, then quietly began bringing extra supplies inside. 3 nights later, snow started falling. The snow started falling softly. Small flakes drifted across Red Hollow beneath gray skies, while smoke rose from chimneys, and children still played beside fences buried under the season's first dusting. Nobody worried. Not at first. Early snow meant little on the prairie. Winter always began politely. Then temperatures dropped. Hard. Water troughs froze overnight. Tree branches cracked across distant hills. Windmills groaned beneath sheets of ice. Old ranchers stopped talking. That frightened people more than weather itself. Because old ranchers had survived everything. If they looked worried, everyone noticed. 3 days later the wind arrived. Not ordinary wind. Prairie wind. The kind with nothing to slow it for miles. The kind that crossed open land gathering force until it sounded almost alive. By sunset fence posts disappeared beneath drifting snow. By midnight entire roads vanished. And by dawn, Red Hollow disappeared. Snow blasted sideways so violently that neighboring houses vanished beyond a few yards. Inside Elias's cabin, he sat beside the stove listening. Not to the storm, to the walls. Cabins always spoke during winter. Logs creaked. Roofs shifted. Windows rattled. Weak places complained. But beneath the sod armor surrounding his home, silence. Almost complete silence. Wind struck the prairie walls outside, then vanished. That unsettled Elias more than if the structure had shaken violently, because it felt like the storm simply couldn't find him. The thick sod absorbed the sound, absorbed pressure, absorbed the world's anger. Hours passed. Snow piled higher. Inside the stove burned steadily. Not roaring, not struggling. Steady. Then Elias noticed something strange. The fire had grown small. Very small. Only glowing orange coals remained. Yet warmth still surrounded the room. Not strong warmth. Stable warmth. The sod walls had spent days reducing heat loss while trapping layers of still air around the cabin itself. The prairie wasn't creating heat. It was refusing to let heat leave. Then came pounding at the door. 3 desperate blows nearly disappeared beneath screaming wind. Elias stood immediately. He forced the door open against the storm and nearly lost his footing. Caleb Turner stumbled inside, carrying his younger brother beneath blankets. Snow exploded into the room before Elias forced the door shut again. For several moments Caleb simply stood there breathing hard. Then he looked around. The fire barely glowed. Yet the cabin felt comfortable. How? He asked quietly. Elias handed blankets toward his brother. The walls are working. Caleb stared. Then another knock came. And another. Harlan Pike arrived with his wife after snow crushed part of their roof. Mrs. Tolland appeared carrying her grandson. Then came the Miller family. By midnight, nearly a dozen people crowded inside the cabin everyone once called ridiculous. Nobody laughed anymore. Outside, the blizzard became monstrous. Wind forced snow through cracks in ordinary cabins. Roofs groaned beneath uneven drifts. Fires consumed wood faster than families could replace it. People fought winter constantly. Inside Elias's cabin, something different happened. The temperature barely changed. Hours passed. The stove consumed little fuel. Still warmth remained. Because heat wasn't escaping anymore. The prairie walls trapped still air inside the root-filled sod layers, while drifted snow packed naturally against the outer surfaces. And snow itself became part of the defense. That surprised everyone. Harlan finally frowned and looked toward the walls. "You're telling me snow's helping us?" Elias nodded. "Snow traps air." Nobody answered immediately, because that sounded absurd. So Elias explained. Fresh snow contained enormous pockets of trapped air. Packed snow insulated surprisingly well. Animals survived beneath it every winter. Burrows survived beneath it. And now his cabin did too. The storm itself strengthened the shelter. The blizzard packed snow against the sod walls evenly, creating another insulating layer outside the original one. Winter had accidentally become part of the design. Caleb slowly looked around. "You built a cabin that uses the storm." Elias added another small log to the stove. "No." He looked toward the thick walls surrounding them. "I built one that lets the prairie do what it already knows." Silence followed, because everyone subtly understood. Prairie grass survived winter long before people built homes here. Long before fences. Long before towns. The roots trapped earth together. Earth trapped air. Snow trapped more air. Everything worked together naturally. For 3 days the blizzard continued. 3 endless days of screaming wind and endless white skies. Inside the cabin, children slept beneath blankets while adults sat beside lantern light listening to storms they could barely hear anymore. The structure simply endured, not resisting winter, outlasting it. By the 4th morning the wind weakened. Elias opened the door carefully. Nobody moved behind him, because people suddenly feared seeing what remained. Outside Red Hollow looked broken. Fences disappeared completely. Several cabin roofs had collapsed. One barn sat buried nearly to the windows. Roads no longer existed. But Elias's cabin still stood exactly where it always had. Snow covered the sod walls completely now. The structure looked less like a house than ever. It looked like part of the prairie itself. Smoke rose quietly into pale morning light. Untouched. Word spread quickly after roads reopened. People climbed hills and crossed frozen fields simply to see it. They expected hidden furnaces, secret heating systems, strange machines. Instead they found earth. Roots. Grass. Questions came immediately. How thick should sod walls be? Would different prairie grasses work? Could existing cabins use them too? Elias answered patiently, because winter had already explained everything better than he ever could. By spring, families started changing their homes. Wind barriers appeared. Earth insulation appeared. Some built full sod walls around existing cabins. Nobody called it Turner's dirt house anymore. The storm ended that permanently. One evening Caleb stood beside Elias watching sunlight settle across the prairie. "You know what bothers people most now?" he asked. Elias smiled faintly. "What?" Caleb looked toward the grass-covered cabin. "They laugh because they thought you wrapped your house in dirt." He paused, then smiled. "Turns out you wrapped it in 6,000 years of prairie survival."